everybody for coming. Really pleased to have this invitation to come and speak at the Freeman Institute here at the Humphrey Center. I've actually been in this building many different times for lectures of one sort or another, and it's great to have a chance now to contribute to the discussions and all the important issues that all of you folks are looking at. As Bob said at the beginning, that there's a lot of interesting things to talk about when it comes to Canada-U.S. relations, and it's something that oftentimes is overlooked, particularly here in the United States, the importance of the relationship. In fact, President Obama, when he came to Ottawa back in February of this year for his very first, it was his first time abroad as president, he had made remarks to that effect that sometimes we overlook one another, and it's important to pay attention to this important relationship. So I'm pleased today to have a chance to spend a bit of time with you and give our perspectives on the relationship and how it's important here in Minnesota. And I should apologize for my voice. I think it's a little bit hoarse, but I was at the Twins game on Sunday. I was at the Twins game on Tuesday before the tiebreaker game, and of course I was just yelling like mad. Unfortunately, Nick Punto didn't hear me when I was saying on Saturday, stop at third base. He couldn't pick it out along with the 58,000 others. So anyway, I guess it's my fault. But it was a fascinating run, and I feel kind of. One thing that Bob didn't mention in terms of the introduction is that I'm lucky enough to be married to a Minnesotan, and we actually met in '87, which was the first year the Twins won the World Series, and we got married in Hopkins, so just outside Minneapolis. We got married in '91, the second year they won the World Series. So we're kind of hoping that now that we're back here in Minnesota on a diplomatic assignment, we're hoping that might bring some luck for the Twins. But unfortunately, it didn't work out that way this year. But hopefully next year will be a different story. So what the overall title I've given for this presentation is it reflects kind of the challenging economic times that we have, and it's to underline really that the Canada-U.S. partnership is extremely valuable in terms of how we both deal with the challenging economic times that we're in. I'll structure the talk basically in three main sections. First, I'll discuss what our office does in Minneapolis. Then I'll talk a bit about the Canadian economy. There may be some things there that may surprise you about the relative strength of our economy at this time. And then the third and final part will be the meatiest part of the presentation will be to talk about the Canada-U.S. relationship and in Minnesota in particular. So let me start in terms of the Consul General. How many people here, when you saw this announcement, was it the first time that you had heard that Canada had an office here in Minneapolis? Don't be shy. Okay, well that's very typical. I mean, Minneapolis is not known for an abundance of foreign diplomatic offices. In fact, the only other full-time office is the Mexican one in St. Paul. The Norwegians have a prominent presence here now, but it's no longer officially a diplomatic career person heading it, but they still have a very effective team led by Walter Mondial as the honorary Consul General. But aside from Canada and Mexico and Norway, not a whole lot of diplomatic stuff going on here. And yet, one of the things that I've certainly come to appreciate in my time here in Minnesota is just how much important work there is going on. And one of the centers for that, of course, is the University of Minnesota. Not just the policy work and discussions that take place here at the Humphrey Institute, but also the very important work across medicine, life sciences, energy, environment. A real amazing amount of important work going on at the university, and we're happy to have an office here in Minnesota to make those connections better. The Canadian office in Minneapolis is actually part of a network of Canadian offices across the United States. We have, of course, an embassy in Washington, which is the main office, and then we have 13 consulates general, which is the kind of office we have here in Minnesota, and we have a number of smaller consulates. So overall, there's about 22, these are the filled-in maple leaves that you see here, about 22 or 23 such offices across the country. And then some of the smaller ones, like you see the hollow maple leaf, those denote honorary consuls, where we have engaged a prominent U.S. citizen in in a city like Omaha or Bismarck or Portland and others to kind of be our, to help represent Canada in that region. And here in Minneapolis, not only do we cover Minnesota, but we cover what we call the Upper Midwest. So it's the two Dakotas, it's Iowa and Nebraska. And we have a staff of 20 in our office, and pleased again that Jennifer, who heads up our public affairs section, and Courtney, who was also in that section, are here today. 20 super staff. 6 of us are Canadians, and 14 are hired locally. And we divide our work into 3 main business lines, let's say. The first is the public affairs, political and economic relations element, which involves reaching out to decision makers and opinion shapers across our 5 states. So it means interacting with the congressional delegations in the 5 states, the governors and the state legislatures, municipal governments, county governments, in order to make sure that they're aware of Canadian views on various issues. Also, of course, part of it is reaching out to academia and students and journalists and so on. The other main business line that we have at the Consul General is what we call the International Business Development Program, by which we're trying to help connect up Canadian companies and U.S. companies in our region to promote two-way trade in goods and services and investment. And increasingly, we're looking at technology partnering to help our companies on both sides of the border develop and commercialize the products of tomorrow. And then the third main area of work is what we call consular affairs, which is largely helping Canadians in emergency situations. Now, fortunately, that's the smallest of our 3 business lines, as it were, but extremely important. So, with that introduction into what we do in our office here, in case we're, and for some of you, I know it was unfamiliar that there was a Canadian office here, so now you know what we do. So I'll go into the second main topic, and that's the Canadian economy. And you'll see the next few slides actually are from a presentation that our Prime Minister gave, Prime Minister Harper gave in New York about 3 weeks ago on the state of the economy. And I think it's important to recognize that there's a number of very important strengths that Canada has right now in the context of the challenging economic times that we're in. And I'll go into more of these in detail, but we have a very strong banking system, a very strong commitment to free trade, expanding trade opportunities. We have a very large stimulus package that is producing results. At the same time, the government has managed to keep taxes, bring them down, while maintaining a solid long-term fiscal position. So the guiding principles behind the government's economic program, as I mentioned, are a real commitment to free trade, having the right kind of regulation and oversight, not only in the financial services industry but elsewhere, social objectives in terms of health care, immigration policy, unemployment insurance, and so on, that are responsible in terms of keeping the Canadian economy strong, and lower taxes and strong fiscal discipline. And that's the program that the government has now going forward, is to keep on focusing on the economic situation, strengthen financial regulation, much of it being done in concert with the G20. And very importantly, and I'm going to get more into this later on in the talk, is that it's critically important to resist protectionism, as that's going to be ultimately destructive to the global economy as a whole. And right now we are doing stimulus spending and incurring some deficits, but there's a plan to get beyond that. So there is, in the Canadian economy, we're experiencing difficult times, just as you are here in the United States, but just as in here, in Canada, we're seeing some hopeful signs of recovery, some growth in June, new private sector jobs in August, and signs of emerging life again in the housing market. This graph gives you a sense of the relative job loss situation. So the blue line represents the United States, with 100 baseline being January 2005. You'll see that in terms of employment impacts in Canada, the recession hit us several months after it hit the U.S., and the relative impacts have been less severe. You know, those of you who may have had an impression of Canada and the Canadian economy relative to the U.S. built up over many years may be surprised to learn that now, for the first time in over 30 years, Canada's unemployment rate is significantly, it's more than 1% below the unemployment rate in the United States. I mean, it's still a problem, and it's still, there's a great deal of hardship, but we're at around 8.7% or so right now, as opposed to, I think, what, 9.8 or thereabouts here in the United States. Canadian banking system, it's a really interesting story. The World Economic Forum, based in Geneva, has now for the second year in a row rated Canada's banks as the very strongest in the world. And you can see there have been throughout the turmoil of the last year or so, no failures of banks in Canada. There's been no bailouts. 3 of the top 10 banks now in North America are Canadian, and that certainly wasn't the case a year or 2 ago. And market share is growing, and I think the record of the Canadian banking system, the enviable record, has allowed us to contribute in a very meaningful way to the discussions that have been going on at the G20 and elsewhere on how best to promote responsible regulation worldwide. In terms of free trade, and this is where I've spent a fair bit of my own career. I think Bob may have touched on it, but most of my career in the Foreign Service has actually been as a trade negotiator in a variety of contexts. In the multilateral level, I was in Doha, for example, in Qatar in 2001 when we launched the current WTO round of negotiations. I've had, I guess, the dubious experience of smelling tear gas on 4 different continents in the context of various trade negotiations and ministerial meetings and so on in South America, in Asia, North America, and in the Middle East. And the Canadian government is very committed to expanding free trade. Unilateral tariff cuts. For example, in our stimulus package, we did not have any buy Canadian policies. There was none of that kind of thing. In fact, when the government came up with the list of policy measures that would help get the Canadian economy moving again, they actually included among those a unilateral tariff cut on over $1 billion worth of machinery imports, because we felt that it was important to grow the economy, to have less costly inputs available to our industry. And in fact, we're looking at expanding those unilateral tariff reductions right now. There have been in the past year or 2 8 more countries that we've signed free trade agreements with, and we're negotiating with the European Union, for example, is a real big one. We're having preliminary discussions with other countries like Japan and India on the possibility of negotiating free trade agreements. So this is a very strong commitment that the government has to free trade. And of course, in the North American context, we have the highly beneficial Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement and the NAFTA agreement, and we're very much committed to trying to build on those to further improve the conditions for commerce in North America. I mentioned Canada has a stimulus package. You'll see from the bar on the left, and again, this may not be something all that well known, but it ranks amongst the very highest of the G7 countries as a percentage of GDP, over 4% when you look at the various levels of government. So, Canada has definitely been doing its part in terms of priming the pump and using spending to try to help get the economy rolling again. So it's been a lot of spending has gone into this, and social dimensions, including support and training for unemployed and maintaining access to credit, are very much part of the overall government economic plan. A strong fiscal position is another feature to really note about the Canadian economy. We had 11 years of running in the black in terms of the government expenditures, and this is the first year that we've gone into a deficit situation in 11 years. And what you can see there is that in terms of the debt to GDP ratio, we're by far the lowest in the G7, just over 25% right now. So we've had the luxury of not running deficits for some time, so that's put us in this very strong position right now. At the same time, we're able to keep driving down taxes. Again, if the perception of Canada is a high tax jurisdiction, well, corporate tax, which was around 22% just a few years ago, is at 15, or will be down to 15% by 2012, which is the lowest tax on business investment in the whole G7. In terms of the tax burden on individuals, Tax Freedom Day now comes 20 years earlier, and we're on track to have taxes down to the lowest level in 50 years. Coupled with this, really good economic story is, I think, a really important element of Canada's, and that's Canada's contribution to providing energy to North America. And now, again, this may be not that well known here, but we're now the 7th largest crude oil producer in the world, 2nd largest in the world when you look at proven oil reserves, 3rd biggest natural gas producer in the world, number 3 when it comes to hydroelectricity, uranium, and so on. And I'll come back to this later, but we're by far the biggest energy supplier to the United States.
Question there.
Yes.
On the proven oil reserves, that include tar sands?
Includes the oil sands, yes. Yes. So second only to Saudi Arabia. And so here's a few clippings. Don't blame Canada and other things that capture some of the good news, good economic news and relative strengths that you're seeing in Canada right now. So I thought I'd use that bit of an eye-opener perhaps for some of you in terms of sketching out the Canadian economy, because I think it really is a remarkable story at how resilient our economy has proven to be so far through the recession. I mean, we're certainly undergoing considerable pain, but there's a lot of good news that I was able to share with you about the strength of our banking system and taxes and other elements. So I'll now move into the third main section of the presentation, which is really to get into a bit more detail on the Canada-U.S. relationship, particularly on the economic dimensions and how that's really important for promoting economic growth and recovery in these difficult times. It really, I mean, when you look at Canada and the United States, there really isn't a relationship like it between any other two countries that I can think of. Obviously, we're neighbors. We have much that we share in terms of families and friendships and language and culture and so on. Huge trading relationship and a lot of very, very close work around the world on a great number of challenges that we share. And so, of course, as I've mentioned many times, one of the main challenges right now is dealing with the economic crisis, and we're doing that together, building on our strengths in North America, and building on the work that we do in Group of 20. But when we look at the world context right now, there's certainly stronger economies emerging in China and India and elsewhere, and this affects the context in which North America has to grow and remain competitive in the world. We need to work together, Canada and the United States, to stimulate economic growth, create jobs, and also on the security dimension, which maybe I'll just spend a few more words. The rest of the talk I'm going to be mostly talking about the economic dimension. But when it comes to Canada, United States, international security issues and security in North America, extremely important. A lot of work that we're doing together. Last year, for example, marked the 50th anniversary of NORAD, the North American Aerospace Command, whereby the skies and the seas around North America are monitored and protected through a joint Canada-U.S. command. We have shared interests in terms of preventing nuclear proliferation around the world. Canada's made huge investments in the former Soviet Union and elsewhere. We have common interests with the United States in terms of promoting democracy and growth throughout the Americas, which is becoming more and more an important part of Canada's foreign policy. And perhaps the most striking example today of common work in the international security dimension is in Afghanistan, where, of course, the United States is very strongly committed, and Canada is too, since the fall of the Taliban. Canada has had a very strong commitment in Afghanistan, not only militarily with some 2,500 Canadian Forces troops on the ground in Kandahar province, which is one of the most challenging, difficult parts of the country, but also in a very, very strong way in terms of development assistance, where Afghanistan is now our #1 aid recipient around the world. And in addition to the defense and the development dimensions of Canada's engagement in Afghanistan, we're also very strongly engaged in a diplomatic sense in terms of relations with the government and helping Afghanistan build its institutions. I came across an interesting fact just yesterday that if you look at Canada's embassy in Kabul, we actually have more Canadians serving in our embassy in Kabul than we have Canadians serving in our embassy in Tokyo. So it just gives you a sense of how very strongly committed Canada is to Afghanistan across all dimensions of governance, of development, and militarily. So in terms of the challenges that I laid out in the previous slide, well, Canada and the United States share an awful lot. We're similar countries, of course, as highly industrialized, well-established democracies. We also work together in a great number of fora. I've referred to the G20 a few times already, and mentioned that Canada happens to be hosting next year's, well, technically we're co-hosting next year's G20 along with Korea, and a meeting will be held in Huntsville, Ontario, and we're hosting the G7, G8 meetings, which are going to be happening back-to-back with the G20 next year. But we're also cooperating in APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, in WTO, NATO, countless other organizations where Canada and the United States are working side by side on these major common challenges. And then, of course, the other shared advantage that we have is our membership in the NAFTA and North America and all the advantages that gives us. So I'll talk a bit more about the trade relationship. It is the single largest two-way trading relationship between any two countries in the world. Canada is by far the biggest buyer of United States goods. It's some $280 billion approximately in 2008, and that is 3.6 times more than China bought from the United States in 2008. So you hear a lot about China-U.S. trade. Well, when it comes to purchases from America, almost 4 times as much is being bought by Canada than by China. Now, China has eclipsed Canada in terms of its exports to the United States. But when you look at the total two-way trade picture, it's still, by far, Canada is your biggest trading partner. We've estimated that across the United States, over 7 million jobs are supported by this trade with Canada. So you're looking at a city almost the size of Chicago is the number of jobs across the country supported by this trade. Many Canadian companies, thousands, well over 10,000 Canadian companies are directly employing Americans, over 500,000, and this, these numbers go to show the extremely important economic relationship in terms of big dollar values, but also jobs right across the country. And I'll get back into later on how that plays out here in Minnesota. Well, I think these slides, sorry, they're a little bit dark here, but the top one illustrates again how, in terms of two-way trade, just over 18% of the United States trades with Canada is the largest that it has with any country around the world. And the flip side of that is that for Canada, as the smaller of the two economies, our trade with the United States is incredibly important for our own export picture. So it's roughly twice the U.S. Size of our trade is roughly twice that of all other countries combined. So extremely important. This just shows the total trade between the two countries. It's growing. Last year reached almost $600 billion in terms of total two-way trade in goods and services. So we're looking at over $1 million a minute, almost $2 billion a day in total two-way trade between Canada and the United States. But it's important to understand that this is not typical bilateral trade in the sense of container loads or ship loads of finished goods being dropped off in the U.S. or vice versa in Canada. increasingly, and very importantly, the trade that's going on between our two countries, it's between companies. It's been estimated that something like a third of the Canada-U.S. trade is intra-firm trade. So it's you know, General Motors moving parts from or cars from one plant in Canada to the U.S. or vice versa. Countless other examples in the auto industry and many others of these cross-border supply chains where over time companies have taken rational decisions that, well, we'll do this part of the process in Canada, we'll do this part in the United States, we'll source this part from Canada, but we're going to source that part from the United States. And so supply chains that can become very complex have developed over time where companies have benefited from the advantages that exist on one side of the border or another. You know, for example, in the automotive industry, it really doesn't matter much anymore whether a car rolls off the line in Flint, Michigan, or it rolls off the line in Oshawa, Ontario. You know, odds are that its major parts of it have gone back and forth across the border multiple times.
And Autopack predates custom by a lot of times.
Yeah, and a lot of that was the strong presence of the automotive industry in Canada was definitely helped by the Autopack, but a number of other factors as well. You know, there's many other examples, and I'll come back to a few Minnesota ones in a short while. But you know, the bottom line is that we don't so much sell things to one another anymore, but we're making things together. And I think that's a really important kind of qualitative leap to make when understanding the nature of the Canada-U.S. economic relationship. It really is a highly integrated one where there's very strong benefits flowing to both parties, both countries, in terms of the way these supply lines and so on have developed over time. So that's a strength that we really need to preserve, particularly in these challenging economic times. And you know, some of the factors that have helped spur these cross-border supply chains are its geographic proximity. I mean, you just look at the map, and you'll see that many Canadian production hubs are actually closer to the U.S. markets than hubs in the United States. Most of Canada's large cities, as you probably know, are strung along our southern border and therefore very close to major population centers in the United States. So geographic proximity is clearly a very important factor in this strong economic integration. But you know, here's a few more pictures to show you just how deeply interconnected we are. You know, take rail in the top left, the road network in the middle, power networks, gas grids for oil, oil pipelines, gas pipelines, and so on. I mean, there's just so much of this stuff crossing back and forth across the border. In fact, if you look at those networks, it's hard to discern where the political boundary is between Canada and the United States, because it's just so deeply integrated in so many dimensions. And so the last two slides talked about the energy. The last two pictures show the pipeline networks for oil and for gas, and it's really important how major a source Canada is to the United States now for energy. We're by far the largest foreign supplier of energy. This has been going on for a number of years. But it's also a two-way trade in energy. There is also energy that's moving into Canada from the United States as well, so it's not purely a one-way flow. Something like 17% of U.S. imports of crude oil are from Canada, and given the fact that Canada has the second largest crude oil reserves, this will go into the future, we expect. Large natural gas exports from Canada to the United States, and also very significant hydroelectric exports. So in terms of a clean, non-emitting energy form, something like 10% of Minnesota's electricity comes from hydroelectric power generated in Manitoba. And if you look to the east in New England, very large percentages of New York State and New England states power comes from the vast hydroelectric developments in Quebec. And when you look at energy security, and we like to refer to energy security in North America as opposed to one of the phrases we hear quite often in the U.S. is energy independence. We have to stop buying foreign oil, for example. That's part of the rhetoric. Well, when you look at where you could be buying oil from, Canada is a stable, democratic, nearby, reliable supplier of the kind of fuels that the United States is going to be needing for some time to come. In the context of energy, I'll also point out that there's a lot of very important work that's going on between our two governments to ensure that we're dealing appropriately with broader objectives to drive down carbon emissions and so on. And this was the clean energy dialogue between Canada and the United States was one of the major initiatives that was launched back in February of 2009. President Obama traveled to Ottawa, and it was one of the main topics of discussion just 3 weeks ago when Prime Minister Harper was meeting with the President in Washington, reviewing the bilateral agenda. They looked at all the progress that had been made on this clean energy dialogue between our two countries. You know, Copenhagen is short form for broader efforts at the international level to try to drive down greenhouse gas emissions, and Canada and the United States are working very closely together on this shared challenge, and it's because we have this integrated North American energy economy. We can't really go it alone in terms of enacting policies and measures to bring down carbon emissions. The Clean Energy Dialogue launched between our leaders had three main sub-elements. We're working together to promote more research and development into clean energy technologies. There's a significant amount of work going on for carbon capture and storage, which is extremely important. For example, in the U.S., where coal is a much more prominent source of energy than it is in Canada. And we're also looking at cooperating on developing smart grid technology in order to make it easier, for example, to bring more wind power and other alternative renewable energy forms onto the electrical grid in an efficient kind of way. Because I'm not sure when the previous slide, when I showed all these various interconnections between, in terms of infrastructure between Canada and the United States, I didn't show the electrical grid, but it's pretty similar in the sense that there's very strong north-south linkages, which is why, for example, Manitoba is able to supply a significant amount of hydroelectricity to Minnesota, why Quebec supplies a lot to New York and the New England states, and so on. In the context of energy and electrical power generation, one interesting thing to note is that the Canadian government has set an objective that by 2020, fully 90% of our electricity will be generated from non-emitting sources. And we're actually well on our way, something in the order of 75% or thereabouts right now is how the percentage of Canadian electricity generated through non-emitting means. And that's principally hydroelectricity and nuclear power. And I think that's actually very different than the situation here in the United States, where I believe that the vast majority of electricity continues to be generated by coal. In Canada, it's a much smaller percentage. And when it comes to smart grids, one of the interesting opportunities is, as the United States and Canada as well brings more wind power into the grid, which is an important thing to be doing. Of course, wind power is not always on, and so you need a backup system, as it were. And we believe that in that context, the hydroelectricity generated in Canada and elsewhere constitutes a very effective backup mechanism to supply power to the grid when for those times when the wind may not be blowing. Certainly preferable to running gas or coal generation facilities. So, but in order to be able to do that properly, you have to have the right kind of grids, and you have to have effective, efficient, smart grids that can bring on quickly alternative power sources like hydro when the wind's not blowing. Sort of back to the Canada-U.S. economic relationship and the job impacts. If you look at it on a state-by-state basis, fully 35 out of the 50 United States have Canada as the top export market, and that's certainly the case for Minnesota and 4 other states that we cover here in the upper Midwest. And if for those 15 states where Canada isn't the #1 export destination, we're certainly #2 or #3. And it translates into big job numbers. As I mentioned earlier, it's about 7.1 million across the United States. And this map gives you a sense of where the numbers are larger in the red areas. Here, this shows Canadian-owned businesses in the United States. A lot of them right across the country, and very strong Canadian investment presence in the United States. About 42% of our cumulative foreign direct investment is in the United States, and that's the biggest country where we invest. In terms of the Minnesota connection, Minnesota is the #1, or Canada is your #1 export partner. Huge trade number. If you look at last year, 2008, over $21 billion as US dollars in two-way trade, and it's almost a third of what Minnesota sells to the world in terms of agricultural goods, industrial goods, and so on, is going to Canada. And in terms of the job numbers, it's over 140,000 in Minnesota that are attributed to that trade. And when it comes to energy, very important supply links. The vast majority of the gas that you might pump into your car here in Minnesota has been refined out of oil that was sent through pipelines to Minnesota, refined in the Flint Hills refinery just outside the Twin Cities and Pine Bend, and also in the Marathon refinery. There's a large natural gas trade from Canada into Minnesota, and I mentioned earlier the hydroelectricity, big contribution there. Minnesota is trading very strongly with several Canadian provinces. Among the key ones, Alberta, and that's for mostly the oil and gas supply. Ontario, a variety of mostly industrial manufactured goods. Saskatchewan, oil and gas and agricultural goods. Manitoba, electricity, but also agricultural goods and several others as well. And Quebec, manufactured goods are very strong there, but also food products and more. Many of Minnesota's, probably all of Minnesota's main flagship companies are in Canada in one way or another, and of course we welcome that in terms of the investments that they've made in Canada. In some cases, the research and development work that they're doing in Canada, the distribution networks they have in Canada, the sourcing that they do in Canada. For example, General Mills Cheerios, are almost all the oats that go into Cheerios are actually bought from Canada. So that's an example of a supply chain. The oats that Canadians will eat, the Cheerios that we eat are more than likely made from Canadian oats, but processed in the United States in Minnesota. And then on the flip side, many Canadian companies, large Canadian companies, are established here, doing well, employing lots of Minnesotans. CP Railway, of course, which now owns the Sioux Line. RBC, Royal Bank of Canada, has its U.S. wealth management headquarters here in the Twin Cities. Thomson Reuters owns Westlaw now, big employer just outside of the Twin Cities. New Flyer Industries, which makes buses, big factories in St. Cloud and in Houston. And there's many other examples of that, and they're they illustrate what they do, how they operate and trade with Canada. Is further illustration of these cross-border supply chains that I alluded to earlier. And another example, I mentioned Cheerios, but another Minnesota example is iron ore. One of Minnesota's major exports to Canada is iron ore from the Iron Range. A lot of that is going to steel mills just outside Sault Ste. Marie, turned into steel, much of which gets sold back into the United States. So iron ore from Minnesota to Canada, turned into steel, sold back to the United States. But if you trace that supply chain backwards, and if you look at who supplied the power, the electrical power, to the Iron Range, to the mines, you'll see that a lot of it is coming from Canada, from Manitoba, supplying electricity across the border to drive the iron ore mines. Well, then you look at the water in northern Manitoba, the vast flows of water that are being used, harnessed to generate all this clean hydroelectricity. Well, a lot of that water, of course, is coming from Minnesota, North Dakota, and elsewhere through the Red River system. So you see these the the extent of these cross-border supply chains where we're making stuff together. It holds in buses, for example, where New Flyer does some of the work in Winnipeg, some of the work in St. Cloud and Crookston. You see it in the agricultural area, many industries where those cross-border linkages exist. Just to round out the kind of things that my office does in Minnesota, we're promoting two-way trade and investment, we're promoting services trade, and increasingly an area that we look at is technology development, technology commercialization, in recognition of the important work that goes on here at the University of Minnesota, but also some of the cutting-edge work in the Mayo Clinic and at the Medtronic and many other companies here in the state. And some of the technologies that we're looking at in particular are life sciences and clean energy, and enabling technologies like nanotechnology and so on. A couple of big events coming up this fall. There's the E3 conference that the University of Minnesota is putting on November 17th, I believe, and that's an important opportunity for Canadian companies and researchers to make connections here. There's the Life Science Alley Conference in December, another very big event where Canada has a very strong presence. In fact, there's a lot of work going on between Manitoba and Minnesota in life sciences in a number of areas. And certainly my own personal experience, having worked at the Mayo Clinic some time ago and having seen just how incredible their facilities are and their capabilities are, I really have a good sense of just how important it is for Canada to be plugged in here, because I think there's a lot of interesting work happening here, and we have a lot to offer as well in terms of our own strengths in life sciences, energy, and so on. And so we actually have an officer who works full-time at our office on technology partnering. I'll maybe move a little bit quicker through the remaining slides so we have a good time for discussion. But we talked about the Canada-U.S. trading relationship, how important that is. We then drilled down a bit more into the Canada-Minnesota dimension, but I think it's important to kind of telescope back and recognize in a North American context the importance of Mexico as a NAFTA partner for both of our countries, and the fact that the NAFTA, since it went into effect, has helped significantly promote three-way trade amongst the countries, again, all to our advantage. The free trade brought about by the NAFTA has made goods cheaper and more accessible to consumers. Some studies have indicated it's roughly $2,000 a year that a typical American family saves as a result of this kind of trade liberalization, and export-oriented jobs have been shown to be higher paying on average than other jobs. I'll kind of go back, veer into more of a micro issue here, but when we're talking about how important, well, it's a very important issue, but it's grasping the effect of what we call a thickening border. Because when I illustrated all these cross-border supply chains and how companies are moving stuff back and forth across the border quickly, and they need to do that in order to produce what they're selling, there is a risk that if the border between Canada and the United States becomes too thick in terms of inspections, fees, and whatnot, that can begin to impede the effectiveness of these cross-border supply chains. Now, I should stress up front that security is extremely important for both of our countries, and we're committed to making sure that the border between Canada and the United States is not a conduit for bad guys and harmful materials and so on that may be going across. So that's extremely important. The challenge now is to be able to deal with those security concerns, legitimate security concerns, in a manner that doesn't impede the trade, the legitimate flow of people and goods across our border. So the objective is a smart border. Yes.
Maybe if I push you a bit toward conflict here. Jenna Napolitano said this is a real border, right, to the U.S.-Canadian border. I mean, how much has the administration done to thicken it, basically, so far?
Well, there's been over the years a variety of of measures that serve to thicken the border. You know, for example, the APHIS fees meant to finance the plant and health inspection service have introduced additional costs at the border. There's more document requirements now. The Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative recently went into effect, or the final phase of that went into effect, where now if you're American and you go to Canada to get back into the country, you have to show a passport or another approved document. So a lot of these things are cumulatively thickening the border, and one of the things that we're always on the watch out for is that measures don't become protectionist tools whereby you know, an additional fee or additional inspection may be misused so that it's not really for security purposes, for example, but becomes a way to impede the border. And you know, one of the things that this slide tries to show is that if each time you bring stuff back and forth across the border, if you're a company and you have to do more paperwork, it's more sand in the wheels of commerce. And an example that many folks use is, you know, if Canada and the United States in the auto industry, for example, are producing a car, and it goes back and forth across the border, there can be dozens of documents and dozens of pieces of paperwork that have to be filled out before that car is ready to go onto the lot of the dealer. But in contrast, if you look at cars made in China or India, you know, they'll just load a few hundred of them onto a boat and bring them into LA or whatever harbor on the West Coast, and there'll be one set of paperwork, and then boom, they're in. So in a sense that we're impeding our ability in North America to make things efficiently, not only for our own consumption, but to sell and export vis-a-vis the rest of the world, to the extent that that undue paperwork emerges along the border. So this is something that I think both governments are committed to dealing with, to making sure that we can address the legitimate and important security issues while at the same time not impeding unduly the commerce. I won't spend any time on this one, but this just shows how some of the costs have been calculated in the auto industry. If you look at the dealing with the paperwork and the taxes and so on, what it means to economic efficiency. And I alluded to the Canada-U.S. cooperation at the border, which is extremely important. There's a number of programs that have been introduced. FAST is a program that lets qualified truckers, for example, go through more quickly at the border in both directions. We have, as an alternative to a passport, there's something called the Nexus card, intended primarily for frequent border crossers, whereby you just present this card and you go through you're expedited through the border. There's various things that we're trying to do to expedite commercial shipments, electronic manifests, and so on. And we're also working together. You know, it's not just about the Canada-U.S. border and making sure that that's secure. Well, it's also extremely important that our common border, if you will, our common North American border vis-a-vis the rest of the world, in terms of shipments from Europe and Africa and Asia and whatever, it's important that we cooperate on security measures for those kinds of shipments. And so containers arriving from Japan or China or whatever are dealt with in a secure fashion before they enter the North American market. And part of it also is investing in the border, and part of infrastructure funding in both countries is going into border-related investments. Let me finish up with just a few slides, and I think all of pretty much what everything I've been saying has kind of been leading up to the main point that given that we have this highly integrated North American market where we're essentially making things together, and given the strong economic challenges that we have right now, it's important that we build on the advantages of our shared North American economy and not do things to impede this kind of very, very important two-way trade and the attributes that it gives us to be competitive against the rest of the world. And this is why in Canada we're very concerned about potential moves to protectionism in the United States. And one example of that is, of course, the Buy American component of the stimulus package, whereby steel, iron, manufactured goods to benefit from federal stimulus funding have to be sourced in the United States, except under certain exceptions. You know, the United States, Canada, and others committed at the G20 not to go down this route of introducing protectionist measures, and yet that's what we've seen, unfortunately, in the Recovery Act. And we're very concerned that this kind of thing might be replicated in future legislation and become the new norm. And it's going to impede these cross-border economic linkages that have served us very well over the years. You know, it's going to, these are the reasons I've already discussed. We're not as competitive as a North American economy if we throw up roadblocks to one another. It can affect the export opportunities in both of our countries. It can impact the supply chains that have been built up intra-firm over many, many years. For municipalities wanting to install, I don't know, water filtration systems or whatever, if they're restricted to a limited pool of suppliers, well, that can drive up costs. It can delay projects. It can raise concerns about competitiveness. If there's only one supplier, well, then they can maybe dictate the price. So these are unintended consequences of these kinds of Buy American policies, which can be very, very harmful to both countries. And again, I stress that in the Canadian federal economic stimulus package, there was no Buy Canadian. In fact, we went the opposite way and unilaterally reduced tariffs on a number of goods. And again, just to emphasize, it's this intra-firm trade, which is approximately a third of the Canada-U.S. trade, stands to be affected by these kinds of policies if they continue. And so that's why we're paying a lot of attention to the Buy American phenomenon and protectionism more generally as a potentially unhelpful element right now. And this just goes into a bit more detail on one particular sector, the wastewater equipment and pipe sector, where there's a very, very large trade in this. In fact, the United States enjoys a surplus with Canada. And it's important, therefore, to preserve, I think, for the interest of both countries, to preserve open markets in this kind of sector. And these systems, these wastewater treatment systems, are bought in almost all cases by municipalities, which have their hands tied right now under the stimulus package in ways they were not restricted before in terms of how they can spend federal money. So that's why this is important. So let me wrap up and we'll move to questions and comments. So the main points that I've tried to share with you this afternoon are the strong integration of our economies, how this is important in terms of wealth generation, developing jobs, opportunities for people in both countries, and now when we're in these challenging economic times, it's important to recognize and preserve and build on those links so that both our countries can be strong and competitive vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So thank you very much for your attention. And
Rob Johnson, in the long period that he was at Cargill and since, has been very active in U.S.-Canadian trade. So I'm sure you have questions.
I have a comment and a question. Two comments and a question. First, thank you for pounding away at Buy American provisions. Always good to remember. Second, I'm always surprised that when one talks about clean energy, one doesn't talk about cogeneration, especially since Canada is our largest natural gas supplier. I would think you would be pushing that technology much more aggressively than you have. And my question is FIRA operating with as open a mind as the rest of Canada's policies?
Investment Canada.
Yeah, I think by FIRA, I guess you're referring to the Foreign Investment Review Act, which has now been, I think now we don't refer to it as that anymore, but there we have the Investment Canada Act. There are, but by law, and I think this goes for virtually any OECD country, investments over a certain threshold have to be reviewed by the government on a number of criteria, and one of those is national security. and there's a few others to determine the public interest in Canada, for Canada in accepting that investment. I think that the vast majority of foreign investments in Canada are given a green light after review. There's been a few very isolated cases where the government decided that it wasn't in the interest of the country. But it's we recognize, we get that foreign investment in Canada is extremely important, and that's completely consistent with the government's overall economic policy that I illustrated at the outset in terms of open markets and so on. We need investment in Canada. It's extremely important in bringing innovation, generating jobs, and so on. But under certain circumstances, we have to review it, just like as in the United States, where there's reviews of foreign investment in certain sectors and over certain thresholds.
I'm sorry, you said that's like in the United States?
Sure. I mean, in the United States, I mean, for the legislation underpinning it may be a bit different, but you know, I can think of at least one example in recent years where there was a proposed investment from abroad in the United States that
right, but it really is well, it's not. But I think there's a real asymmetry having to do. I think there's a real difference in policy, but there's a great asymmetry in size, and I think it's the traditional Canadian concern about inundation that underlies both fear of investment in Canada and also, you know, the special attention to cultural industries.
Yeah.
I just think it's inevitable. But I don't think there's really much similarity. There have only been just a couple of minor rejections so far under the legislation that came with the 1988 changes in American law.
But there's certainly political resistance. I mean, I think of this Dubai Ports investment.
And that's
for
the
example,
one, that's
is
the one example. I mean, you know, the one or two examples get the attention. And I'm not, that's not an attack on Canada. I think you have real concerns. I mean, I think the proportion of the Canadian capital stock that was owned in the United States and still is huge. And it's completely different from the Canadian share of U.S. capital.
Yeah, although it's as I was saying,
It's changing.
Canada has a very large investment in the U.S. and there's actually the difference in value between U.S. investments in Canada and Canadian investments in the U.S. is declining. The difference, and you know, Canadians are investing elsewhere too. If you look at Europe, we've got about almost $100 billion invested in Europe, which is similar to what Europe has invested in Canada. So we're becoming increasingly investors abroad. Partly that is because we understand that there's a link between job creation and investment abroad, because we sell to the Canadian subsidiaries abroad.
To what extent is the falling dollar part of that equation? Is that a net benefit to the Canadians, or are there some other risks because of the cross-border trade?
Yeah, no, good point. Well, what's been happening in the last few months is of course the United States dollar is going down, the Canadian dollar is going up. And that does make it more challenging for Canada to export. And the changes have been very significant. I think it was just 7 or 8 years ago that the Canadian dollar was worth only about 63 cents U.S. And today, I mean, there's been a lot of movement just this week. I think when I left the office, it was we were at about 96.4 that's how many Canadian dollars worth 96.4 cents U.S. And in fact, about a year and a half ago, or almost 2 years ago, we were worth $1.10. So these kind of fluctuations do impact, and yes, it is having an impact on the competitiveness of some Canadian exports to the United States. On the flip side, however, Canadian industry sources a lot of its equipment and technology and capital goods from the United States. And so to the extent that our dollar is going up, we're able to bring in some inputs more cheaply. So that's one of the silver linings in this.
You mentioned briefly some science and technology partnerships between the U.S. and Canada. I was wondering if you could speak more to that.
Well, it's there's a lot going on in a variety of sectors. For example, you know, polar science, a lot of Canada-U.S. cooperation there. A lot of it last year under the International Polar Year, looking at the impacts of climate change in the north, for example. We're jointly mapping with the United States right now the seabed in the north, partly for reasons of preparing our respective bids for sovereignty under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. There's joint research in the energy field. I mean, one, for example, is carbon capture and storage. Lots going on in that field because we have a shared interest there in the United States. Obviously, with a huge coal power production, it's important to find ways to hide there, to capture and store the carbon. We're interested in as well because of all the hydrocarbon development in Canada. And there's a concrete project happening, a cross-border project, in fact, between North Dakota and Saskatchewan, where there's a coal gasification plant in northern North Dakota, which is pumping its CO2 through almost a 200-mile pipeline into Saskatchewan, where it's being driven down into oil wells for two reasons. One, to store the carbon, but secondly, to help drive up the oil in an efficient manner, and it's called enhanced oil recovery. So that's one of the technical areas. But with Canada and the U.S., there's cooperation across untold sectors when it comes to science and technology. A lot of it just routine stuff where colleagues in universities are collaborating because they share the same field. Some of it spurred and driven by governments in certain areas like energy, space science. A lot of work going on in that. I could, if you give me your coordinates afterwards, I could email you something that can give you a bit more detail. But it's just like everything else in the Canada-U.S. relationship. It's just across every sector imaginable. There's work going on.
Did you mention something about nanotechnology in your presentation, or did I just miss?
Yeah, no, I mentioned nanotechnology in the context of an enabling technology, where we see opportunities here in the United States generally, and in the upper Midwest and Minnesota more specifically. And that, of course, has applications in a great number of sectors. But there's important work going on in Canada and here, and opportunities to work together.
Just going back to the G20, you're going to be hosting it next year. What and with your strong banking system, what in the context of international finance, or what way is Canada looking or not looking to become a leader on either regulation on international finance, or working maybe to restructure some international financial institutions?
Well, I think that the performance of the Canadian banking system and the financial system more generally in the last few years has I think given us a fair bit of credibility in terms of the value that we can add to the discussions at the G20 and elsewhere on appropriate financial reform. I mean, I'm of course not directly involved in those discussions, but I understand that when the Sherpas and when the senior finance officials in the G7 countries and then more broadly in the G20 get together, that increasingly the Canadian contribution to the discussion is folks will take it more and more seriously because we do have a very good story to tell, and certainly the outcomes at the G20 meeting in Pittsburgh and at the G7 meeting before that were the kinds of recommendations and agreements that the leaders settled upon for financial sector regulation and other related areas certainly were well in line with the kind of things that we were seeking, kind of that appropriate balance between regulation and free market, if you will. So I think we have had a voice. I don't know at this point. I'm not sure if anybody knows kind of what the agenda is going to be in particular for the G20 next year. But as the host, that gives us an additional level of ability to try to help shape the agenda, and I'm sure we'll keep contributing in an important way on in the financial sector and building on the good track record that we have so far.
What we often hear, Martin, and you can correct me about this, it's probably an oversimplification, is that the story behind the success, relative success of the Canadian banking system in the present crisis, is that we all went through the same period in the 30s, and we passed a lot of regulation then, and you guys did as well. And then when we deregulated, you didn't deregulate as much. I mean, that may be an oversimplification, but that's the way I've heard the story told. Is that essentially?
Yeah, I think that's fair. There's been bit more regulation and oversight in Canada, and also maybe a more conservative posture on the parts of the banks themselves.
Reserve requirements.
Reserve requirements, yeah. The ratios are lower in Canada than in other countries, And I think there was some criticism of Canada maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago of Canadian banks. They were saying, oh, we're too conservative, not taking enough risks, etc. But it's the way things have played out. It actually has turned out to be to our advantage. But there's other related public policy measures that have an impact. For example, in the housing market, where we didn't have the subprime kind of meltdown that was here. Canadian banks had very limited exposure to subprime loans. In fact, much of that was through the U.S., their exposure. But when it comes to home ownership in Canada, I had a conversation with Kate about that earlier, we have interest rate payments for mortgages are not tax deductible in Canada. And yet we have a similar policy outcome at the end of the day, which is approximately 68-69% home ownership in both countries. But the fact that the interest rate payments were not deductible, I think it could be argued, helped prevent some of the excesses that we've seen elsewhere.
But then, on that note, the capital gains exemption that we got in the late '90s under the Clinton administration. Do you have anything like that in your tax regime?
Yeah, it's. I believe there is a capital gains exemption. I believe it's in the order of $100,000 right now for individuals. I don't quote me that as authoritative, but there is an exemption. And as I mentioned earlier, that the tax rates, individual tax rates, are coming down. Canada corporate rates are coming down as well. So it's more, so that we're more competitive in terms of attracting talent and capital from around the world. You and you.
I've got in fact two questions. The first one, you've mentioned that you negotiate free trade agreement with the European Union. I would like to know what are the most important issues for you in that respect. And the second one, the stimulus package, 4% of GDP 2009-2010. I wonder whether you have any strong cooperation between the federal level and the local level as far as this crisis is concerned.
Okay. Well, first on Canada-EU, these negotiations have just started. So it's very early in the day, but we have the EU collectively is our second biggest trading partner after the United States. There's tariffs on a lot of goods going back and forth. I mean, I can think from my time as a negotiator. I remember aluminum was an issue in terms of Europe having tariffs on Canadian aluminum. Shrimps is an issue. There's various restrictions in the area of the services and investment that we'd be hoping to address in a negotiation with the European Union. Agriculture is a very big area. Of course, Europe has strong barriers on a number of agricultural products. So those are the kinds of things that we would be seeking to address. But I think the first sort of formal negotiating session, I think, has either just happened or is just about to happen. So it's quite early days in that process. But both countries studied carefully the potential benefits and are committed to doing that. On the stimulus package, yes, there was a lot of cooperation between the federal government and the provincial governments. The 4% figure that I showed you is the combined stimulus measures taken by both levels of government.
And I'm sorry, there are other questions. Perhaps Martin will be around after we've broken up, and you can speak to briefly. I want to thank you again for a terrific talk, and I bet people, I know I learned a lot. I bet everybody else did too. Thanks again. Come back, everybody, in 2 weeks' time. Something quite different, but in some ways related. Kay Husband's Feeling is talking about, we talked a lot about direct investment today. She's going to talk about the racial impact, the impact on different parts of the labor force of incoming direct investment into the United States. So that's here in 2 weeks.